Wesley Granger had always believed that the world was still a place where people could live in peace, mind their own business, and let the land breathe under their feet. For 35 years, he had worked the land at Willow Creek Ranch, a place that had been in his family for generations. It was a place where he woke every morning to the chirping of birds and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, a world that seemed timeless, unbothered by the demands of the modern world. He could hear his great-grandfather's voice in the breeze as he walked through the fields, the man who had built the farm, and who had always believed in the hard work of the earth, the sweat of one's brow, and the wisdom of nature itself. But Wesley never anticipated the storm that would change everything, the storm that would be set in motion by a single woman and her very small, very bright, very pink toy gun. It all began with the arrival of Rosewood Estates, a suburban development that slowly but surely crept closer to his family's land. At first, the new neighbors were just an inconvenience. He didn't mind them much. They kept to their manicured lawns and their HOA meetings. He had his chickens, his crops, and his quiet life. But that life was slowly unraveling with each passing day. They came with their complaints, their notices, their demands. A trim here, a coat of neutral paint there. Wesley, a man who had seen generations of farmers come and go, was not about to be cowed by the new wave of suburbanites who thought they could dictate his way of life. It started with letters, polite, at first. Requests to trim the grass here, paint the chicken coop there. Wesley had little time for such trivialities, so he tossed the letters aside. They were harmless, right? Just some bureaucratic nonsense. But as the days passed, the letters grew bolder, more insistent. Fines for his free-range chickens. Warnings for his unsightly wooden fence posts. It wasn't long before Wesley began to realize this was no ordinary HOA, it was a personal crusade led by one woman. Evelyn Blackwood. She was a retired real estate agent who had moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago and had appointed herself the self-proclaimed guardian of community standards. Her vision for Rosewood Estates was one of uniformity, of perfection. Everything was to be pristine, every property to conform to her vision of suburban utopia. And Wesley's farm, with its chickens clucking about freely and its fences that were far from aesthetic, was a glaring imperfection in her world. One afternoon, Wesley was feeding his chickens when he heard the sound of car doors slamming. He turned to see Evelyn striding across the field toward him, her heels clicking sharply on the dirt road. Behind her, 3 HOA board members trailed awkwardly. They looked uncomfortable, like they didn't belong here. But Evelyn? She walked like she owned the place. She always did. Wesley stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Can I help you, Mrs. Blackwood?" With all the poise of a woman who was certain she was in the right, Evelyn declared, "Wesley Granger, you have exactly 24 hours to bring this property into compliance with our community standards, or we'll take legal action." Wesley didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't afraid of her threats, her fines, or her promises of legal action. But when Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out that bright pink toy gun, pointing it straight at his face, he realized the kind of person she truly was. The absurdity of it all hit him like a slap in the face. A grown woman, standing in front of him, pointing a plastic toy gun and screaming at him about the farm that had been in his family for over 150 years. And in that moment, Wesley made a decision that would change everything. The absurdity of Evelyn Blackwood pointing a pink toy gun at Wesley Granger's face wasn't lost on him, but what he saw in her wasn't just a woman out of control, it was the face of someone who believed she could rewrite the rules of the world. Wesley had spent a lifetime working the land, a world where there was no room for such petty arrogance. His great-grandfather had taught him the value of hard work and respect for the land, but Evelyn had no respect for either. She didn't understand the blood, sweat, and tears that had gone into Willow Creek Ranch. It wasn't just a farm, it was a legacy. His legacy. It was the land his ancestors had fought to preserve, and no toy gun-wielding HOA member was going to drive him off it. With Evelyn shaking with fury and her plastic weapon still aimed at him, Wesley did the one thing she never saw coming. He smiled. Her eyes widened, her grip tightening on the bright pink toy, and for a brief moment, she looked like a villain from some absurd sitcom. Wesley stood there, calm and steady, watching her shake with rage, but he didn't feel fear. No, he felt something else, clarity. He knew he wasn't going to back down. He had fought for this land, and he would fight for it again. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said in a quiet voice, enough to make her pause. "You just made a serious error in judgment. The kind of error that might cost you everything you think you own in this neighborhood." The words hung in the air as the silence stretched. Evelyn's face turned a deeper shade of red, her breath coming in quick gasps. But she wasn't ready to let go. She wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. Wesley turned and walked back toward his house, leaving her standing there, stunned and seething. As he entered his home, his mind began to race. That's when he remembered the property records he'd been studying. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Evelyn had been playing a dangerous game. She was trying to control the neighborhood, manipulate the HOA, and push him off his land, but what she didn't realize was that she hadn't done her homework. Wesley fired up his computer and began going through the old property surveys, county records, and land ownership documents he had gathered. Hours passed, but he didn't stop. What he found in those records made his pulse quicken. It was the loophole. The very thing that Evelyn had overlooked. The law that would allow him to take control of everything she thought she owned. In that moment, Wesley knew he had a chance, an opportunity to strike back. It wasn't going to be a quick win, but it was going to be a win. This wasn't about the toy gun. It was about power. And he wasn't about to let Evelyn Blackwood have it. The next morning, Wesley made his first move. He reached out to some trusted contacts, starting with local real estate agents and bankers. His mind was set on acquiring properties Evelyn had been buying up through shell companies, planning to take control of Rosewood Estates. But there was a catch. She had done it all under the guise of a perfectly legal setup, but the paperwork wasn't finished. There were properties, neighboring homes, and land that hadn't been transferred properly to the HOA. Wesley had discovered that if he could acquire enough of these properties, he could take over the entire neighborhood, and the HOA would be his. Wesley wasn't a businessman. He was a farmer. But that didn't matter. He had enough land equity in his family's farm, and with a few quick loans and a little bit of research, he realized that he could turn the tables on Evelyn in the most satisfying way possible. His plan wasn't about revenge. It was about saving his home, his farm, his legacy. And he would use everything at his disposal to protect it. Wesley Granger sat back in his chair, surveying the documents spread out before him, each one more damning than the last. His fingers drummed against the worn wood of his desk, and for a brief moment, a slow smile crept onto his face. The realization that Evelyn Blackwood, the woman who had threatened him with a toy gun and harassed him for months, had made one fatal error filled him with a quiet satisfaction. She had thought she could control Rosewood Estates, pushing Wesley and others around to fit her perfect vision of suburban perfection. What she didn't realize was that she had left the door wide open for someone else to come in and take it all from her. The documents he had gathered were the key. They were the missing pieces to Evelyn's house of cards, a house that had been built on arrogance and deceit. What had started as a quiet, peaceful farm for Wesley had now become a battleground. But this time, he wasn't going to back down. Wesley's mind raced with the possibilities. If he could purchase enough of the properties around Rosewood Estates, he could gain control of the HOA. The rules would no longer be dictated by a woman who thought she could impose her own vision on others. The very same vision that had tried to erase Wesley's farm from the landscape. He had lived on his land for 150 years, and he wasn't about to let a newcomer with a toy gun dictate his future. The next few days were a blur. Wesley made calls, sent emails, and worked with private lenders to secure the financing he needed to begin acquiring properties. He was making deals, taking advantage of the gaps in Evelyn's paperwork. Slowly, but surely, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Wesley wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was playing a game that Evelyn had started, and he was going to win. At the same time, Evelyn didn't stop. Her tirade against Wesley had escalated with every passing day. More letters, more fines, more complaints. It was as if she believed the world should bend to her will. She erected huge signs at the entrance of his property, warning the neighborhood about his alleged violations. Each one more grandiose than the last, as if trying to force the community to pick sides. In her mind, she was the hero. She was saving the neighborhood from the looming threat of Wesley's chickens and his rustic farm life. But the more she fought, the more Wesley knew he was on the right path. Every letter she sent, every fine she imposed, was a step closer to the final confrontation. Every bit of drama she created only fed into his plan, making it more inevitable that her reign was coming to an end. Wesley's breakthrough came one afternoon when he was sitting on his porch, sipping coffee. A neighbor, Daisy Miller, had come by for a chat. Daisy was the oldest resident of Rosewood Estates, having lived there longer than anyone except Wesley. She'd seen it all, the changes in the neighborhood, the growth, the construction, and the slow erosion of the community values that had once made it special. "I don't know how much longer she's going to push," Daisy said, shaking her head. "That woman has bought up nearly every house around here, but she hasn't finished the paperwork yet. She's trying to control everything, but there's a loophole. If someone else buys those properties before she finishes, they'll own the neighborhood." Wesley leaned forward, his heart pounding. A loophole. It was the key to everything. All he needed was the right moment. The right amount of leverage. And he could turn the tables on Evelyn, take control of the very thing she thought she owned. That evening, Wesley stayed up late, poring over the property records once more. The more he examined them, the clearer the path became. He had found it. The legal document that would allow him to gain control of the HOA. The rules were simple: the HOA could only acquire neighboring properties if they owned more than half of the land in the subdivision. But Evelyn hadn't finished buying those properties. Wesley had learned the most important lesson of all. Never underestimate a man with nothing left to lose. He wasn't just a farmer anymore, he was a man with a plan. A man with the power to take everything Evelyn thought she had and turn it into dust. The tension in Rosewood Estates had reached a boiling point. The walls that had once stood between neighbors, as invisible and oppressive as they were, had cracked wide open. People were starting to realize that the quiet farmer who had lived among them for decades was no longer willing to be pushed around. And as for Evelyn Blackwood, she was becoming desperate. Her facade of control, which had been built on threats and fines, was crumbling. She had pulled out all the stops, trying to drum up support with her grand speeches about the future of the neighborhood and the need for progress. She held emergency HOA meetings and hosted poorly attended rallies, but all her words fell on deaf ears. Even her own board members were starting to look uneasy, as if they had realized the real battle was over, and they had chosen the wrong side. Wesley watched it all unfold from a distance. Evelyn's attempts to rally the neighborhood against him were laughable. People were tired of her tactics. She had bullied them for too long, fining them for every little imperfection, forcing them to live in fear of minor violations. Under her reign, Rosewood Estates had become a place of tension, where neighbors didn't speak to one another unless it was to report a supposed infraction. But now, the air had shifted. Residents were starting to see through the thin veil of her self-righteousness. And that's when Wesley made his move. It was a crisp fall morning when he walked into the community center, just as Evelyn was preparing for what she thought would be her moment of triumph. The emergency HOA meeting had been called for the sole purpose of pushing through her final decision, the forced acquisition of his farm. Wesley could hear the whispers of residents as they filed in. They were curious but uneasy. They didn't know what was going to happen, but they knew it wouldn't be business as usual. Wesley knew exactly what he was doing. He had the documents, everything he needed to take control. He walked to the front of the room and took a seat, placing a thick manila folder on the table next to him. It was labeled in bold letters, Rosewood Estates Property Acquisition Documents. Evelyn didn't see him walk in. Her back was to him as she fiddled with her presentation materials, but as soon as she turned and caught sight of him sitting in the front row, her face went pale. It was as if she had seen a ghost. She launched into her speech without missing a beat, her voice shrill and rehearsed, but Wesley could see the crack in her composure. Every word she spoke was a defense, an attempt to hold on to her illusion of control. She spoke of community standards, of the beauty of progress, of the need to reshape Rosewood Estates for the good of all. When she finally paused for breath, Wesley stood up slowly. The room was silent, watching him. He didn't speak immediately. He just walked to the front of the room, holding the folder in his hand. His every step felt like a slow drumbeat, a march toward the inevitable. He reached the front and placed the folder on the table. There was no need for grandiose words or dramatic flourishes. The moment spoke for itself. He could feel Evelyn's eyes burning into him as he moved with quiet authority. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I think you might want to postpone this vote until you've had a chance to review some recent developments in property ownership around here." The tension in the room was palpable. The board members exchanged nervous glances, but Evelyn's pride held her firm. She had no idea what was coming. She was still convinced she was in control. But Wesley knew she wasn't. He stood there for a moment, his eyes locked with hers, before turning and walking out of the room without saying another word. It wasn't a grand exit, but it was enough. He had planted the seed. Now it was only a matter of time before Evelyn understood just how deeply she had underestimated him. The days following Wesley's unexpected exit from the HOA meeting were filled with an uneasy silence, a quiet that seemed to swallow up the once dominant voice of Evelyn Blackwood. She had spent the past few weeks convincing herself and everyone around her that the neighborhood was behind her, that her vision for Rosewood Estates was not only right, but inevitable. And yet, despite her delusions of grandeur, the cracks in her control were becoming undeniable. As the hours stretched into days, Evelyn's anxiety began to show. Her phone calls grew more frantic. She sent more emails, tried to rally the remaining board members for emergency meetings. But one by one, they started to pull away, citing personal matters or illness, anything to avoid being dragged deeper into her losing battle. The board that had once hung on her every word was slowly disintegrating, leaving her alone in her delusions. But Wesley wasn't going to let her retreat quietly into her own mess of deceit. He knew exactly how to bring everything to light, how to show the world just how deeply Evelyn had miscalculated. He had the documents, and now he was going to use them. 2 days later, he scheduled a public meeting at the community center, inviting anyone from the neighborhood and beyond who had been affected by the HOA's tyrannical rule. Evelyn, still fuming and disoriented, didn't expect what was coming. She walked into the community center that morning, attempting to carry herself with the same air of superiority she once had, but it was evident to anyone paying attention that her facade was crumbling. Wesley had prepared a meticulous presentation. He was calm, collected, and, most importantly, armed with undeniable facts. He had gathered every piece of evidence he needed to expose Evelyn's reign of terror. There were receipts for every fine she had imposed, every illegal action she had taken, every threat she had made. Wesley stood before the crowd, his face steady, his voice unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what you're about to see is the real story of Rosewood Estates, a story that Evelyn Blackwood has tried to bury with threats, lies, and intimidation. Today, I will show you the truth." The room grew still. Evelyn, who had been sitting near the front, shot him a look of contempt, her jaw clenched tight. She didn't know what he was going to say, but she knew it couldn't be good. Wesley began his presentation, displaying charts that tracked the rise in fines under Evelyn's rule. As the crowd watched in silence, the numbers spoke for themselves. Fines had increased exponentially, all for violations as petty as a child's toy left in the yard or the wrong color of flowers. These were the violations that had led to the destruction of the sense of community in Rosewood Estates, and Evelyn had been the one to enforce them. The crowd shifted in their seats. Some of them had lived through the nightmare of Evelyn's rule. They had feared her. But now, they were beginning to see the truth, the manipulation that had been going on right under their noses. Wesley then pulled out the final piece of the puzzle, the documents that proved Evelyn's legal failures. She had tried to acquire the entire neighborhood under her control through shell companies, but the paperwork had never been finished. Evelyn had bought up properties, but the HOA itself had never officially acquired them. Without the correct documentation, she had no legal claim to the properties she thought she controlled. The room was silent as Wesley dropped the bombshell. "As of today," he said, his voice clear and final, "I own 57% of the properties in Rosewood Estates. I have the right to call for a new vote and replace every single one of the HOA board members." Evelyn's face turned ghostly pale. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She was frozen, her eyes darting around the room, looking for someone, anyone, to back her up. But it was too late. The residents of Rosewood Estates had already made up their minds. They had seen the truth. They had heard the stories of her abuse of power, and they weren't going to stand for it any longer. Wesley had become more than just a farmer, he had become their beacon of justice. The room erupted in applause as the weight of Wesley's words settled in. The transformation had already begun. The power had shifted. Evelyn was no longer in charge. She had overplayed her hand, and the very people she had tried to control were now the ones taking control of their own futures. As Evelyn stood frozen in place, Wesley turned and walked to the exit. He didn't need to say anything more. The damage had been done. That evening, Evelyn received a letter from Wesley's legal team, informing her that the HOA board was being dissolved, effective immediately. She had lost everything. The dream of a neighborhood perfectly curated to her standards had crumbled, and there was no one left to fight for her vision. But Wesley's fight wasn't over. The next day, he announced his candidacy as the new president of the Rosewood Estates HOA. And when the vote was held, it was a landslide. The residents, tired of fear and control, elected him with overwhelming support. The morning after Wesley Granger became the new president of the Rosewood Estates HOA, a new era had begun. The transformation was palpable. For the first time in years, the sun seemed to shine a little brighter over Rosewood Estates. The oppressive atmosphere that had once hung like a thick fog over the neighborhood had lifted, replaced by a sense of unity and optimism that hadn't been felt in far too long. Wesley stood at the front of the community center once again, this time as the leader of a neighborhood that had been through so much. He had fought for this moment, not out of a thirst for power, but because he had witnessed firsthand what Evelyn Blackwood's rule had done to the people who lived here. The fear, the stress, the constant worry about whether the next violation would cost them more money or even their homes. It had to end. His first order of business was simple: to restore the sense of community that Evelyn had destroyed. There would be no more surprise fines for minor infractions, no more petty power plays. Instead, Wesley introduced a new set of guidelines, simple, respectful, and centered on the well-being of the residents, not their ability to conform to a set of arbitrary standards. The first step was to focus on genuine community improvement, fixing what Evelyn had ignored, and, more importantly, listening to the people who had been living in fear for so long. Wesley made sure to keep the community involved in the decision-making process. He invited residents to town halls, where they could voice their concerns and ideas for improvement. And to his surprise, they did. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out began to open up. They talked about the things they wanted to change, the ways they wanted to make their community better, and the pride they had in their homes, their families, and the land they had worked so hard to build. The changes Wesley made were immediate. He introduced a new community service program, not one that punished people for trivial offenses, but one that brought neighbors together to work on shared projects, community gardens, park cleanups, and even organizing neighborhood barbecues. Residents who had once feared each other now found themselves working side by side. The place that had once been divided by fear was now united by the simple act of cooperation. But perhaps the most satisfying part of the transformation was watching Evelyn Blackwood, who had once held such power, become a mere shadow of the woman she had been. The once mighty HOA queen had been dethroned, not just in the eyes of the community but in her own mind. The irony of the situation was too perfect for Wesley to ignore. Evelyn, who had spent years making life miserable for others, was now living under the very same rules she had imposed on everyone else. Her rent, set at 10 times the normal rate, was a constant reminder of her downfall. Wesley had made sure she would pay for the damage she had caused, but it wasn't just the financial burden that weighed on Evelyn. It was the humiliation of having to live under the scrutiny of the very people she had once controlled. Her house, the one she had once called her fortress, was now just another property, and she was a tenant, a victim of her own hubris. Evelyn had no choice but to comply. She was assigned community service duties, and though she tried to maintain some semblance of dignity, there was nothing dignified about picking up trash and cleaning the playground equipment she had once deemed aesthetic inconsistencies. The woman who had once wielded her authority with an iron fist was now reduced to cleaning up the very neighborhood she had tried to bulldoze. Wesley found a certain satisfaction in this. But more than that, he found peace in the knowledge that he had restored the heart of Rosewood Estates. The place had become a sanctuary for its residents, a place where people were free to express themselves without fear of arbitrary rules. There was a new sense of pride in the air, and it was contagious. Over time, the community began to flourish. The farmers' market that Wesley had started, featuring fresh produce from his farm and handcrafted goods from local residents, became a weekly tradition. It wasn't just a place to shop. It was a place to connect, to share stories, and to build the bonds that made a neighborhood feel like home. Wesley's farm, once seen as an eyesore, was now celebrated as the heart of Rosewood Estates. Children, who had once never seen a chicken up close, were now regularly visiting Wesley's property, learning about sustainable farming, and developing an appreciation for the land. Meanwhile, Evelyn's world had shrunk. She continued to live in the same house, but her once important presence in the community had all but disappeared. She was no longer the power behind the curtain, pulling strings to manipulate everyone around her. She was simply a resident now, one who lived under the same rules as everyone else, her complaints falling on deaf ears. One particularly telling moment came when Wesley walked past Evelyn one morning as she was sorting through the recycling bins. She had taken on the task of organizing the community's waste, a job that no one really wanted, but it was one that had to be done. As Wesley passed her, he paused and offered a simple word of advice. "You know, Mrs. Blackwood," he said calmly, "it might be a little easier if you break down the cardboard more efficiently." For a moment, Evelyn froze, her eyes narrowing at him. But Wesley wasn't being cruel, he was simply reminding her of the role she had played in all of this. The same woman who had once fined people for trivial things now found herself struggling with tasks that didn't require power or prestige, just humility. Her response was a muttered remark, but it was clear to Wesley that she had already lost. She had lost her control, her pride, and most importantly, her ability to force others into submission. And so, life in Rosewood Estates continued to thrive. The sun rose over the neighborhood, casting a warm glow over the farms, gardens, and homes that had once been under Evelyn's oppressive rule. The community was stronger now, forged in the fire of adversity, and Wesley Granger had proven that sometimes, the best way to fight back against injustice is not with anger or vengeance, but with truth, patience, and a little bit of good old-fashioned heart. As for Evelyn, she would be remembered not as the woman who saved Rosewood Estates, but as the one who tried to destroy it, only to watch it rise again, stronger and more united than ever before. And Wesley, the farmer with nothing to lose, would go down in history as the man who saved not only his farm but the very soul of a community. The legacy of Rosewood Estates was no longer about conformity or fear. It was about respect, connection, and the understanding that true leadership was not about controlling others, it was about serving them. And as the farmers' market filled with neighbors, children playing in the newly renovated park, and laughter echoing through the streets, Wesley stood quietly on his farm, watching it all unfold. His heart swelled with pride, knowing that he had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been afraid to stand up for what was right. The community had reclaimed its soul, and with it, they had found the strength to grow, together.